Welcome everyone to our session today, Information Literacy as a Concept and Practice. Where are we going? I am so excited to have you all here today. We have a great audience. We currently have more than 300 people here. So it's going to be hopefully, I think, a really great discussion for everyone. But I did put in there the chat, and I'll put again in the chat links to the slides and the Padlet for today in case you'd like to take a look at those. So as I know a lot of folks know already, this session is part of an ongoing series that we've been offering celebrating 50 years of information literacy. So it started with a panel discussion that I organized back in April on 50 years of information literacy. And that was such a great discussion that there were a lot of interest in having additional discussions. So organized several different follow-up discussions here. So if you can access those slides, I put that link in the chat. All of those are recorded, and you can go back and take a look at any of those that you might have missed. I'll mention not all of them have made it quite up to YouTube yet, so some of them are still links to direct recordings in the folder, but we will get all of these up and ready to share on YouTube as quickly as we can. But just wanted to make sure that folks had access to any of those in case you missed any of those. Some quick participation guidelines. So again, we do have a pretty big audience here today. Engagement is definitely encouraged, but it is not required. If you would rather just sit and listen, that is totally understandable. We will have a poll. We'll have the link to the Padlet. I'll share that in again. You can feel free to share in the chat. If you do have, because the chat tends to go pretty quickly and there's a lot of folks commenting in there, if you do have questions that you definitely want our panelists to respond to, if you want to go ahead and add those to the Q&A, that will make sure that we don't miss any of those questions that are coming through. And we'll ask folks, since we do have such a large audience, we'll ask folks not to use the raise hand feature for now. Please go ahead and use the chat or use the Q&A for your questions. So as I mentioned, we do have a Padlet already set up for today. I'll put that link there in the chat one more time. So a bunch of resources have already been added to that Padlet. But if you have other resources that you would like to share, please feel free to go ahead and add those. That will remain a resource that's available to folks. So go ahead and add anything that you have that you think other folks would be interested in seeing as well on that Padlet. And then we're going to do just very brief introductions to our panelists, and then we'll go ahead and jump into our discussion. So I'm super excited and grateful that all of our panelists are able to join us here today to share their expertise and their experience. So we have Veronica Arellano Douglas, who is the Interim Associate Dean for Research and Student Engagement at the University of Houston Libraries. So thank you, Veronica, for being here. We have Clarence Mabey, who is the Associate Dean for Learning, and W. Wayne Booker Chair in Information Literacy at Purdue University Libraries and School of Information Studies. Thank you, Clarence, for being here today. We have Sarah Miller, who is the Librarian for Interdisciplinary Teaching and Learning Initiatives at Michigan State University. And thankfully, Logan Rath, Librarian at the State University of New York, Brockport, joining us. So thank you again to all of our panelists for taking the time to be here with us today. And we'll go ahead and jump into our discussion. So we're just going to start with like the big question. So the title of this session is Information Literacy as a Concept and Practice. Where are we going? So we wanted to start by just giving each of our panelists a few minutes to be able to to talk about how they would respond to this question. Right. So is any of our panelists who would like to jump in and answer first? And I can go ahead and call on someone if we.
I can go if you like. Okay. Okay. Hi everyone. Again, Clarence Mabey. Well, first off, I want to say thank you. It's wonderful to be on this panel, but I also want to just thank Jane for putting this panel series together. The fact that so many of us are here, I think, is just a sign that, we really need to be having more of these kind of conversations. And so I think it's kind of brilliant and amazing that Jane put all this together for us. So thank you. Let's see. So, my answer to this question would normally be to talk about how information literacy needs to be recognized as a discipline, because that's the work I've been doing lately for the last couple of years. But we're going to talk about that a little more in a few minutes. So I'm going to save that. So then I had to think about like, well, what is my answer to this question? So I guess, looking forward, I guess made me also look back a little bit. And I was thinking that I've been a librarian for 19 years, which so means that next year I'll have one of those awkward anniversaries with a zero in it. But so I was thinking about, what was going on when I was a library student. And I remember being sort of interested in information literacy, but I wasn't sure how much. And so I went to the ACRL conference in 2004. And I went to every session I could about information literacy, and everyone was talking about these sort of different exercises that they would do in their classroom. And I went home and I thought, well, that's, I guess, interesting, but it seems like they've really got that one sewed up, right? I should probably look for something else to do within librarianship. And then I met my my mentor from my master's program, Dr. Mary Somerville, who's now retired, but so she sort of pointed me towards reading information literacy articles in which researchers were really looking at sort of information literacy as as a social construct, I would say. And it really just opened the world for me. I was like, this is fascinating and something that's really important. And I would say it's probably like I had a shift, right? I transformed a little bit in my understanding of like information literacy and what I wanted to do with my career. Uh, and, I really think, like, I think of information literacy as sort of the education for the age of information. That's how I sort of came to think of it back then. And in some ways, I still think of it that way today, right? But I do think it's no surprise to anyone to say that, the age of information always never fails to surprise us, right? So it's always some new thing that we are constantly responding to, like AI or disinformation, campaigns essentially, and things that we as educators need to sort of think about how to address for the learners that we work with. But I also think, we in this time, right, have brought ourselves to this work in ways that, have really maybe transformed it. And I like to think maybe had positive influences, right, on our world. So, in bringing a critical lens and really thinking about how information literacy can help address inequities. I think that that's part of the way forward is to continue that work. And so I guess for me, when I was thinking about it is like sometimes I think that we think we're not well positioned to make change. And I think that all the time, like, but I'm over here in this space and it's hard for me to sort of imagine sort of affecting, the big picture, right, of things. But I do think that all of these acts that we do as educators do have an influence. And so for me, I was thinking when I read this that, maybe the question isn't where are we going, but maybe the question should be, where do we want to go, right? So if we kind of think of ourselves as empowered educators, then how do we want to shape what happens next?
Thank you so much. Great, great, Clarence. Yeah, that's a really important question. Where do we want to go? Wonderful. Which of our panelists would like to speak next?
I can go if no one else would. So thanks for that, Clarence. It really got me thinking as well. And when I think about this question, where are we going? I also started my librarian career about the same time you did, Clarence. And I remember being so excited and thinking about, wow, this really relates to this, and this really connects to this. And oh, look, I wonder what we could do here. And I think that's really still the same. I think there are so many places that we could go with information literacy. There's so many kind of synchronicities with other things. There are so many fields and disciplines that can have input into what we're doing. There's so many opportunities, especially I'm on a very large R1 campus, and there are so many places for interconnection and partnerships and just ways for IL folks to build into other disciplines and programs in teaching, and for those things to build into us as well. And so I see the future as kind of an expanded set of connections. And it's interesting to hear you mention affecting change, Clarence, as well, because I think that the more I see myself involved in different things and having more input into my own work, I see changes happening in smaller places, and it's kind of encouraging to see that going forward. I think that I was considering this question from the standpoint of having seen the evolution of standards to the framework and all that, and I think that one of the this is related to one of our other questions, but one of the biggest differences for us now in information literacy is the framing of what we do as threshold concepts, which the framework is based off of. And I think that threshold concepts have given us huge opportunities to both kind of affirm the way that a lot of us have been teaching information literacy, and also give us opportunities to think about it in new and different ways. Again, this kind of openness to be considering input from other disciplines, from other fields. There are so many other fields that contribute to how we understand things, and a lot of folks have done research in these areas. We have fields like psychology, neuropsychology, sociology, educational theory, scholarship of teaching and learning, ethics, philosophy, epistemology, spirituality, journalism, so many different fields that contribute to how we understand how people interact with information. And I think that threshold concepts have given us kind of the language to work with some of these other disciplines as well, to speak with faculty, to think about what we're doing, to think about where students might be on this journey. Threshold concepts also present the idea of the liminal space, which is, where people move from one thing to the other. And it takes a while, it's helped us to kind of think about, we know that we just don't do our work in one shots, but it kind of gives us a way to think about that in kind of the arc of learning, and, what else might be going on with people who are learning about information literacy and people who are teaching it. So, I have a lot more to say to that, but that's kind of the frame for where I think we're going, and I will pass it on to our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Logan, Veronica?
Sure, I can go next.
Mhm.
So, Sarah, that was a great introduction to what I've been thinking about this question. And so I come to information literacy about the same time as both of you did. I came into librarianship, and I come from education. And when I did my doctoral work, it was in education, and I worked under Heidi Julian for my information science and information literacy piece. So, she's a prolific scholar in this area. And one of the things that I took with me about where we're going is hopefully we're remedying some of the issues with the framework. So the framework is great if you have enough understanding to know what the words mean. And in my research, I've come across a number of people that look at the frames as learning objectives. And they're never meant to be that. And the first 2 pages of the document spells that out. But most librarians I know don't read the first 2 pages of the document more than once to read and understand, okay, it's setting up the document, let's move into it and let's have discussions. So I'm hoping where we're going is through this revision of the framework, a little more understanding and a little more support for our colleagues that don't have doctoral degrees in practice theory to understand what it means to really teach authority as constructed and contextual, and to understand that the definition I use for information literacy is one that usually makes people's heads sort of tilt to the side. And that is, I like Anne-Marie Lloyd's definition that information literacy is a way of knowing. And it complicates things. That definition complicates things because it's not cut and dry. It doesn't say that we, the librarians, are necessarily the disciplinary masters of information literacy, right? It requires that partnership for us to understand what the valued ways of knowing in a specific context are. But I do hope that we will get there through these revisions that are coming up, through the scholarship that's being done, through understanding how we as a discipline are using our founding documents and how we're understanding information literacy. One of the shifts that I'm still seeing taking place is the way we like to talk about information literacy as a set of skills. And that's sort of my soapbox that I get on, and my colleagues, and I know a few of them are on this call, will always hear me whenever somebody says skills. I'm like, practice. Let's use the word practice. But even understanding what practice means takes more knowledge than we come out of library school with. So, to set up some problematic statements for the start of this panel, I guess that's where I'll leave it.
Thank you, Logan. And Veronica?
I love the problematic statement. This is great. So I actually want to go back to Clarence's question, that kind of rephrasing of like, where are we going to where do we want to go? Because that's just a really interesting way to think about IL and our practice of it and our study of it. I have been teaching in libraries since 2007, so it's been a little while. And in thinking about this question and the one that Clarence posed, I realized just how much my own relationship with information literacy has changed over that period of time. And in 2021, a few years ago, I gave a talk at WILU where I really wanted to look at the kind of narratives or stories of information literacy that I'd been introduced to, bought into, like used as my own over the years. And I think taking that kind of like narrative inquiry approach to information literacy is a really interesting one. And I think where I've landed now in terms of where we're going, where I'd like us to go, is this kind of expansion of information literacy outside of just an academic context, to one that is a social practice, as Logan was discussing. And that turning point for me, I think, started with being introduced to ideas of critical information literacy and critical librarianship in the 2010s. And then also Allison Hicks, who talks about information literacy as a social practice and something that shows itself as opposed to something that we are imposing on others. And I think that's kind of really stuck with me as I transitioned teaching at a small public liberal arts honors college to where I am now at the University of Houston, which is a large R1, largely commuter campus. And the students and the learners that we're interacting with here have completely full lives outside of the academic context. And in many cases, right, the academic context isn't even the most important part of their life, and their perspectives on how they interact with information to solve problems in their regular lives and their academic lives has been really fascinating to uncover and to see how those practices are like born out of the communities that they come from. And I use community broadly, right? It can mean a variety of things, whether your parents or your cultural community. And I guess maybe to sort of close it out, I'll say that most recently, my thinking has been also really shaped by doing readings related to interdependence in research with one of my U of H colleagues, Natalia Kapuscinskis, and some research we've been doing into the idea of information marginalization that comes from a really good paper from Gibson and Johnson. And just that idea that there is a really strong relational component between information, communities, people in communities. And I've also been seeing that a lot in some of the writings, especially from Jesse Lawyer, related to Indigenous information literacy. So I think I'm maybe seeing IL as really bound up in community and relationality at this point. So yeah, I think that's kind of where I've landed.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much for that. So we do have one more like scheduled question, but there's a great question in the chat that I think aligns with what folks are talking about. So I'm going to go ahead and take a look at that really quickly. So Paul has asked that workplace info lit seems that it should have a high priority, but it looks like it's under addressed. So how do we promote that? So anyone have any thoughts that they would like to share on Logan?
Ooh,
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Paul, by the way. So I was just typing a response to this, Jane, when you picked up the question. So it is undervalued because it's our own disciplinary language. And this is sort of a segue into the next question that we have planned. I think the idea of workplace information literacy is not something that is being talked about in the workplace. Because the people that do it, the way of knowing and the way of doing information literacy in the workplace is not defined as information literacy. It's typically defined as job competency, or, it's measured through your annual reviews or your whatever checklists your company uses. So I think that the idea of workplace information literacy is brilliant for us as librarians to use as a term to describe why we're not teaching how to evaluate empirical research to future welders. Right? Because it's not something they're going to do. Empirical research is not a way of knowing in that field. So we have to change how we talk about it. We have to use our knowledge as information professionals to talk about what is information literacy in the workplace and translate that into words and phrases that make sense to the students that are in front of us.
Thank you. Thank you, Logan. Would anyone else on the panel like to chime in? Go ahead, Clarence.
So let's see. So I completely agree with Logan, and then there's like the caveat part. So so I mean, I think you're right that or I agree with you that the idea of workplace information literacy, right, is something that's important. And I would say, like at Purdue, I mean, a lot of our librarians work really closely with departments, and that's what they're doing. And yes, I mean, we have this language issue of sort of the language of our discipline, if you will, versus what people understand and the language that they're using outside of it. And I think, from my standpoint, it's like we should use whatever language is useful at that moment to sort of, achieve our goals, right? So if other people want to say something else, then, we can talk about it that way if it's productive and useful for the learners in that, community. But I do think that information literacy is, for me, is a sort of a bigger sort of, entity, right, that has all sorts of aspects to it. I mean, I've been arguing that it's a discipline. And so I think that students also, there are other things that I would want my students to learn about, right? So I'd want them to learn about, how the role of information in our society and how, it's, how it is used in certain ways that are, productive and in ways that are inequitable, and, sort of bring them into that conversation that, maybe they're not really thinking about, and so on and so forth. Like, I think there's, information literacy is a sort of large creature with lots of, arms and legs. And I guess for me, I think I think in lots of our jobs. Maybe our job is to support workplace information literacy, and I think that that's what we should do and can do, and sometimes that's what we're hired exactly to do. But I also think that there's this sort of bigger idea and bigger sort of aspects of using information that we also want our students to learn about.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, just to build on that too, I think this makes me think about some of these more meta ideas going on with information literacy that can cross disciplines. And one thing that I also think about, you know, in addition to, yes, they're very different specific disciplinary parts to IL, whether you're working in a trade field or you're working in an academic field, there are going to be, you know, parts of IL that will help in those areas. But one thing that I also really like to think about is personally, how do we react to information? And, you know, some fields may have, you know, more inflammatory information that you encounter or things like that. And maybe that won't be, you know, so much of an issue if you are, you know, going into a trade or something like that, but you never know. And being able to think about yourself personally in relation to information, I think is a huge part of IL, which can cross into workplace applications as well as more you know, research applications that you might be going into an academic field. So I think that those kinds of dispositions that we think about as far as our own kind of habits and the way that we personally deal with information are great for any of those situations. And so I think focusing on those more as a concept, I think might help us think about how we work in different across different fields.
Veronica, would you like to jump in, or want to?
Just really briefly, I really like that Sarah brought up that idea of dispositions, because I think about, well, how do we teach workplace information literacy outside of the workplace? And so rather, are we looking at what kind of frame of mind, what kind of disposition, what kind of affect, what is that like mindset that would be helpful to people as they go into the workplace? And that's where I think, Sarah, your discussion about dispositions is really interesting.
Wonderful. Oh, yeah, Clarence, yeah.
So one thing we've talked about in a group I'm involved in is this idea of like that information literacy is transdisciplinary, or others use the phrase intradisciplinary. And so like I think sometimes we talk about it as information literacy exist in these other fields, and I think that's true. I guess what our group talks about, it's the information literacy as a discipline group, is you know, that it can be a thing unto itself. It's a discipline, and yet it can also take place within other, you know, disciplines and professional context, right? And so it's not maybe an either or, but it's a, you know, an and, it's all those things.
Great. I think that leads us perfectly into our next area of the presentation today. So we wanted to do a quick poll. So we've talked a little bit, you've heard a little bit about this idea of information literacy as its own discipline. So we wanted to have a chance to let our participants tell us what they think of whether or not information literacy should be considered its own discipline. So I'm going to launch a poll really quickly, and we'll give everyone a chance to share their response to this. So the question is, or the statement is, information literacy should be considered a discipline. So we'll let everyone have a few seconds to respond there. Response is coming in really quickly. So, lots of good response. So it looks like things are slowing down a little bit. So we will go ahead and end the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right. So hopefully, oh, did it share the? Are you all seeing the results? There we go. Okay. Yes. So it looks like we have 35% who agree, 13% who strongly agree, but we also have about 34% who are not sure, and about 15% who disagree, and a smaller amount, about 3% who strongly disagree. So opinions are fairly widely spread on this issue. Not a super strong agreement, but also not super strong disagreement on there. Lots of folks kind of in the middle, maybe not really sure. So thank you all for sharing your responses there. So we wanted then to hand it off to our panel again to talk more about this question of, should information literacy be considered discipline? Why? How might this change things, or why not? And Clarence, I'll go ahead and pass it off to you first, since you've been talking about this a lot in the past couple of years.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jane. But I'm very curious to hear what others have to say on this topic. But so as I said, sort of my work the last few years has been focused on this, and it's which I love because, I think that I have always been sort of focused on the classroom. My research has always been about students in the classroom, and sort of getting involved in this work has sort of taken me zooming out to have a, this sort of much, 360 view of the sort of things happening in the field. And it's been exciting and really interesting and thought-provoking for me to go on this journey. When Karen Kaufman, my colleague, who started sort of a group called ILLiad, Information Literacy as a Discipline. So she called together people in 2021 and asked us to think about this. And at the time I was, I actually probably wasn't sure. I'd never really thought about it before, but in the work that we've done since, I've really sort of become a believer in the idea that information literacy is a discipline. And we looked at Sheila Weber and Bill Johnson's work, and they joined the group eventually, and they're British UK researchers who have for a long time been talking about this idea of information literacy as a discipline. And so for me, it's actually that it's not really a question. It's sort of that it is a discipline by in doing research and thinking about what is a discipline, and then does information literacy meet those requirements? I believe that it does. It's more, but I think it's important that we consider if we want to sort of recognize it, and can we make use of it as a discipline? And so, the characteristics of a discipline in our looking around at the literature are, things like that there's a community. So, like us, we're all here today and forming a community, that we have communication channels. I think that we have traditions and history. And so when we talk about Zherkovsky and, the coining of the phrase, and of course, there's counter narratives that, bring up information that suggests that he wasn't the first to do that. But I think those are our history, right? Our traditions, things that always get talked about, the Prague Declaration and stuff like that. But I think the more contentious ones are things like, what is the knowledge base of information literacy? And, do we have a shared understanding of what knowledge is? And those are the kinds of things I think that we could, discuss and debate as a field. But anyway, so I guess what would change, right? And I think that's really the crux of it. And that's why Karen started the group. I shouldn't speak for her, but I believe her initial idea was, if we recognized information literacy as a discipline, would it enable us to act within our universities in ways that we can't now, right? So that was sort of the motivation. I recognize that I've had conversations about, the idea that disciplines really come from, a earlier time and are tied to various baggage of their own. And so maybe, but I believe that if we are a discipline and we're coming to sort of shape and form it, then we have a say in what it looks like. And so I think we can address some of those challenges that, things that we don't like perhaps about other disciplines. But anyway, so I guess the short answer is nothing really has to change. We could just keep doing what we're doing. Information literacy could be a discipline, but I do hope things do change, right? So I think one opportunity would be for us to advocate for developing our own curricula, right? So Purdue has started a information studies minor that much of which I would say are about information literacy or data literacy types of courses. And there's about, I know that there's 5 or 6 other university libraries that also have disciplines. Also have started minors. And so I think that we are maybe moving in directions like that. But I think we could, think about, is there opportunity there? And, it wouldn't be the same for everybody, and all institutions are different. So I think it would be what makes sense in your context to do. Can you leverage the idea that information literacy is a discipline in helping you do those sorts of things that you want to do?
Thank you, Clarence. Who would like to speak up next?
I mean, I can talk, but Veronica, you go.
Okay. So if we're thinking about that poll, I am very, very much firmly in the not sure camp. It's something I've been just ever since hearing Clarence first talk about this at conference and reading a lot of the pieces that are on the Padlet now. I'm still in a very unsure state. And I think part of what is causing big tension and a lot of feels for me is the kind of relationship between information literacy, information studies or information science, and then the practice of librarianship. And I am really concerned that, like, are we looking for a disciplinary label as a means of legitimizing the work that we do? And if so, where does that leave librarianship, right? Because the practice of librarianship is not just information literacy. And so I think that's been like a site of tension that I haven't quite resolved for myself. And I'm somebody who's always been an instruction librarian, right? So to me, IL and librarianship are really deeply connected. So yeah, I think I very much see IL as a field of research, as a subject, like as something that we can study, something that's born out of communities that we can learn from. But I think the tension between disciplinarity and then librarianship as a profession is like real to me at this point.
Veronica, I want to follow up what you're saying, and I want to ask a question back to you. Are we the only people worried about legitimizing our profession? Right? I think that that's something that comes up way too often, is we feel the need, for whatever reason, I don't know what the reason is, but no one else seems to care that we exist on campus. And I mean that in the kindest way possible, right? I have not once in the 18 years that I've been at my institution, I think it's 18, had the president of the institution or a dean say, well, no, we should get rid of the library. In the same way that they are downsizing other academic programs. It's just not something that's happening. And so that's where I wonder if it's because information literacy is so young as well. We're still figuring it out. We're only 50 years old. Whereas if you look at some of the other fields like education, that's thousands of years old. But it's fascinating to me how librarians feel the need to sometimes find ways to legitimize their profession, but we're the only ones doing it to ourselves. I think libraries will always exist, right? How many times have we read flaming pieces from higher ed saying libraries are dead, books are dead? They're not. We still have hundreds of thousands of them 2 floors up from my office, stuff like that. So I'm just so curious what's going to happen as we go through these growing pains. And I am with you as well that I think information science is the discipline and we are a subset of the discipline, but the same rules apply. So it's really nitpicky when you get down into, is info lit of a discipline, because I think as a subset of another discipline, a lot of the same rules would apply.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Sure, unless someone else wants to reply to Logan. Okay, I just wanted to kind of throw another part in here. I was also really on the fence about this for quite a while, and I still kind of am on the fence. And my answer is, well, yes and no, to the question. And I very, very strongly feel that IL's transdisciplinarity it's one of its greatest strengths. And so that's been the way that I've been able to branch out and find these kind of synergies across fields and across different things with pedagogy, with faculty development. Its transdisciplinarity has been one of its its biggest strength. And so at first I was like, well, no, it's transdisciplinary, it can't be a discipline, but I guess maybe it could be both. And I know that on the website, and Clarence, you do have a quote about transdisciplinarity as well. So it's interesting to think what could be the best of both worlds for that. I think framing it as a discipline, again, like Logan said, we're only 50 years old, and I have to say I'm the same age as information literacy, but it is very young as a discipline, and but disciplines like education, right, where it's interesting to think of it. It's a blend between theory and practicality. I mean, educators are teaching, right? They're also in the classrooms doing these things, and so I think there are a lot of there's a lot of modeling done with the huge history of education that we could really learn from and say, how can we develop a discipline that has both really intensive research and practical applications for people working in librarianship, for people also working with information literacy and other positions. So it's a very interesting question, but I hope we really wouldn't. I really hope that putting it into the form of a discipline would not silo it further. And I would hope that it would have the opposite effect of really having input from other fields. The other thing too is I somewhat agree with Logan and somewhat disagree with Logan in your, estimation of the place of libraries. It's different across institutions, right? And at my institution, they are trying to unionize faculty, and they have the biggest holdup now is they've decided to leave librarians out of that union, even though we are actually classified as faculty. So there are questions like that where having it as a discipline may help with librarians as faculty. It may also, I don't know. So there are other practical things like that to consider.
I should say I am very lucky that I am a unionized faculty librarian as part of SUNY.
Yeah, I would only throw in that I think it is very different across institutions, right? So at our institution, for example, a few years ago, there was the question of, should the librarians be faculty? And then there was interestingly, it was sort of, we heard different things from the administration, some of whom said, well, actually, they not only are a faculty, but they should teach a curriculum, right? So, so I do think that people outside of libraries are involved in the conversation of kind of what we're doing and what it should look like in a way that surprised me, actually. But and I know that's different at every institution, but it is a part of the conversation.
Yeah, there's a lot of discussion in the chat about the issue of the value and, librarians feeling not valued at their institution, some feeling valued at the institution. So it definitely really is very different across institutions, the landscape that we're looking at for sure. Any additional comments that folks would like to add in around this question of information literacy and the discipline? We have a few questions in the Q&A that we can get to as well. Go ahead, Clarence.
I just want to say, I love that the panelists sort of fell out exactly the way the poll fell out, sort of split.
I wanted to add one thing because I've been reading the chat and it's super interesting. I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. I would caution against thinking that making IL a discipline will lead to more respect for librarians or for librarianship. And we're seeing in higher education, the the move towards adjuncts, lecturers, non-tenure track faculty as opposed to tenure track faculty. And that's occurring in all disciplines, right, across the board. And I just don't know if I'm willing, or like, I think it's a really important and interesting conversation to have whether IL should be a discipline. I just don't want it to get wrapped up in the sort of status or importance or place of librarians in academia.
And I think that that actually aligns really well with a great question that Caitlin has in the chat. How does information literacy as a discipline help with faculty status for colleagues who specialize in collection management systems and other non-instructional areas, particularly in institutions where disciplinary faculty are all required to teach? Which I think is a great question. I know there's kind of been a divide in the field, sort of like teaching librarians and non-teaching librarians. So I'd love to hear any comments that folks have about that comment that Caitlin raised.
Yeah, so I can chime in here a little bit. Knowing, first of all, that the focus of this panel is information literacy, and we're all information literacy people here. So take what I say with a grain of salt, that the way academic departments in schools, at universities fall down, the way we define those are a group of scholars that teach, right? And that's the money-making enterprise of the university, because the university is a business at the end of the day. It has to be financially solvent. And we in the libraries are generally one of the departments that spends a budget and does the opposite of bringing money in, right? Now, we support all of the other areas of all of the other academic departments, but I think that's where it gets tricky if you're going to define faculty status by those who can teach and do scholarship and do those activities, because my colleagues in technical services don't do that as their day-to-day thing. The work they do is extremely important. You know, if they don't catalog and order and analyze our collection and make sure we have the right electronic resources, the rest of us in the entire university can't do their jobs, at least not easily or well. But I don't know. I think there's a way to have professional staff there. If you're going to define faculty as those who teach, right? We also have a category of employees. Now, my colleagues are faculty in the library that do the technical services work, and we just define that differently. And we've educated our higher ups through our promotion and tenure document about what that field looks like. And we fight for those colleagues if we have to. Luckily, we seem to be in a pretty good place where they just sort of say, yeah, that's the library, you do your library things. We also have a statewide organization that was born to support and advocate for librarians. That's the SUNY Librarians Association. So we've got some history there. But I do think that in other institutions, even within the SUNY system, we're seeing professional staff that have a lot of the same safety nets of tenure and a lot of the same safety nets of faculty status, but they're in a professional line. But again, we have a very powerful union, and we're just lucky.
All right, so we've got several questions. I'm going to go back to here. Oh, missed the Q&A section. All right, so we got several questions in the Q&A, so we'll try to get to as many of these as we can. So Nicholas asks, so in regards to information literacy as a discipline, do we know if communications departments are having the same conversations about IL's cousin media literacy being a separate discipline? Anyone have any thoughts on that?
I don't know about media literacy per se, but I do know that, I mean, you know, things like, I believe bioinformatics, at least a good deal of the people in that field feel that they are a discipline. The one thing that I, you know, in looking around, one thing that I was really struck by was there are so many things that I there's so many fields that I took for granted as disciplines. And if you look around, you can see that they're having discussions in the literature about whether they're a discipline and they're feeling challenged, right? So one particular one I remember was like I think it was geology or something was, they often feel that the work that they do is taking place within another context. And so, people are questioning whether they are a discipline or whether they are doing work within another discipline. And so things like that I think we struggle with as well, right? With this idea of being transdisciplinary, that a lot of our work happens within another field. So I don't have an exact answer, maybe someone does, but I think that if they're not, they're probably discussing that idea as well.
I think that actually aligns really well with the question that Bill had put in the Q&A. So could information literacy as a discipline be transdisciplinary if we conceived of it as we do ethics, which can be taught on its own, but also finds a home in other disciplines like medical ethics, legal ethics, professional ethics? Seems to me that being transdisciplinary is not a detriment to information literacy as a discipline. Go ahead, Clarence.
Okay, so I've been sitting on saying this for the entire session. Are we a subset of literacy as a discipline? And I ask that as someone who studied literacy and have written about the fact that we're using different language to describe the same conceptual things. And so you see that literacy gets broken down into a bunch of subfields: media literacy, visual literacy, disciplinary literacy. You can go on forever. Anything can have literacy attached to it. And so I wonder if we are a subdiscipline of literacy without actually talking to our colleagues in the literacy world.
And I will jump in and say one thing really quickly. So I had a professor who is a literacy expert who has contacted me multiple times to tell me that information literacy is not a thing. It does not exist. Literacy is completely distinct in his mind, at least. So that's a really interesting question. I'm not sure all literacy experts would agree that information literacy is a sub-discipline. But Clarence, you had raised your hand.
Right. So, I mean, I think that's something we need to work out, right, as a field. But I mean, so for me, the sort of significant moment of sort of moving into the age of information, if you will, that information literacy, came to exist. And I do believe that if you look at the literature, right, there are many discussions of how it relates to literacy in general. But I think that it was a kind of a new concept. And, while not everyone agrees, I think that a lot of other literacies, to me, sort of, are part of information literacy, because I think they're all looking at something that's, I would say, a subset of this overarching idea of information, right? So I would include data literacy and digital literacy kind of under this umbrella. So.
I
Go ahead, Sarah.
Sorry, I like that you mentioned disciplinary literacy, because that's the focus of our first year writing classes, which I know many information literacy librarians work with across the spectrum. And disciplinary literacy has been such a natural fit for information literacy in our context. And it also ties into workplace, because they have to look at their, what fields they're researching and going into as well. And that has been such a great fit for us as practitioners, as teachers. And it's been, again, one of those ways that we've been really able to very, very, integrate really well with our first year writing program, and not just do a, library intro or whatever. It's been really, really great for us to be able to integrate that way. So I think that some of those, connections with other literacies are very important for us to think about. And it's an excellent question that you have.
I'm really glad that you mentioned first year of writing, Sarah, because I was thinking about Bill's question in regards to like our kind of kinship with rhetoric and composition, and how there was a whole chat discussion going on about that earlier. That's really interesting. So many interesting discussions, but that idea of like writing in the disciplines, rhetoric and composition across multiple disciplines. What does it look like to be writing in chemistry versus history, right? Like I I really like that idea of InfoLit as something transdisciplinary that you can look at within a context, but that you can also look at sort of at a meta level above it, much in the way that you can with like rhetoric and composition.
Wonderful. So I think we have time maybe for one or two more questions. One question. So Martha had asked earlier, in the post-pandemic world, are you seeing a lot of students having difficulties conversing about anything, much less information? How might we resolve some of this isolationism?
I think I've noticed a increase in the need for reference interview skills on my part to sort of help students think through their questions. But it's not that they can't speak about it. It's just that they're not fully sure of how to do so yet. And in my mind, those are two very different things. And it's part of the apprenticing them into the idea of being a searcher and thinking about their topic in a scholarly way.
Thank you, Logan. Other comments on that question?
Just maybe thinking about, I understand the sentiment behind the question, and I've heard various questions like that and had the same kind of concerns, but maybe kind of thinking about it less from like a deficit mindset and more like how has our information landscape changed, right? How has our way of communicating and interacting with others changed? And maybe what we expect to see in our information literacy classrooms has changed because of some very real world events.
Any final comments on that question? So we do have one more question. I don't know if we'll be able to really get to it because it's kind of a long question, but Donna had asked, let me see if I can get this really up really quickly. So Logan had mentioned the importance of how we communicate about information literacy in several of his comments. I'd love to hear more about this importance to the future of how we understand, teach, and develop information literacy as a concept and practice. So less about coming up with one-for-one synonyms for IL in different knowledge domains, but more about how we can speak about information literacy reflects what we know about it. So thoughts about how we do this more intentionally and mindfully as a professional community. So any thoughts on that as we kind of close things up? Any kind of final comments that folks would like to share?
Well, I love that question. I guess I don't think there's an easy answer, right? But because I feel like you know, we've been having this conversation for, you know, the 50 years of our young discipline, right? But I do think, I mean, I personally think that things like, you know, if we can grow our curriculums and teach more credit-bearing courses, which a lot of people are doing now, if we can take our research outside of the space of academia and sort of work on, you know, real-world issues, right? Like, I think information literacy and librarians doing information literacy research can play a role in helping you know, address disinformation and address the AI challenges and things, both in academia, which we're very poised to do, but hopefully outside. And I think that that helps us kind of in different ways that it explains to, you know, people outside of our bubble, kind of the work that we're doing.
I
Great,
think
Sarah.
real quickly, I know we're running out of time, but I was looking at the chat as well. And this idea about information literacy and related to ways of knowing. I know that we've all kind of touched on this a little bit. I think it's extremely important as we go forward. And it's related to the question about how we communicate, what our communities are like, how we know things. And I think that frame being brought to information literacy will both help us conceive of it as a discipline and find ways to talk about it with others as we go forward there.
All right, so I think we have reached the end of our time. So please, everyone, join me in giving a big thanks to all of our panelists today for being here and sharing their knowledge and their expertise. And I wanted to thank all of the participants for today for being here. And yeah, I just hope everyone has a wonderful day. And thank you all so much for being here and participating.